we're gonna dive first into this topic that is just I feel like it pops up every time there is like a bad weather situation, and that's the MLS calendar. This conversation comes up and it's usually a non-starter, right? Like very few people I think are looking at these arguments and then like, oh yes, that's what we're gonna do and it's gonna be great. Like you either feel like it should be or you shouldn't. But we're gonna share our thoughts on it. So I'll start by asking you, my friend Connor, just do you like the idea of the calendar switch? We haven't talked about any of the positives or negatives yet, but where do you stand on the calendar changing idea?
I'm glad we're finally talking about this. I feel like the idea has been floated on Twitter for a long period of time now, and I feel like it is just another excuse for people to try and make MLS be as European as possible. And I think we are getting to the point where if if this I don't know what to label them. I guess it's the pro rel crowd. So I'll just kind of label them generally as that. If the pro rel crowd got everything that they've been asking for, we would look so much like England. I think we would be a half step away from Taylor Twellman analyzing games in a British accent. Like it's just ridiculous how much we're just trying to mirror the European. Like, why can't we just have our own style? Why do we have to do everything the exact same as Europe? I'm completely fine with the way the calendar is now. I think it makes sense for a lot of the weather that goes on in the country with the snow and the cold that some of the northern teams like Minnesota and Canada teams go through. I think it makes sense to have the calendar the way that it is now. I don't see any reason why we need to change it just so we can be on the same schedule as England and Germany and all of the other European countries. I haven't seen any situation right now where we're suffering drastically because we're on different calendars.
I think you put that pretty well in terms of kind of the anti-calendar change movement. I myself don't really care. I know that this is my league, this is my team, right? Whenever they play, I will be watching, right? Like that is just who I am. The conversation for me then becomes a much more neutral point of view because now I can look at it knowing that it doesn't matter where it is, right? But I know that I will be watching. And now the mindset for this for me is how does this affect the general viewing? Excuse me, the general viewing of the league, of teams. Where does it go from there? So, I dove into this and I will share some with you about the positives and the negatives of what this is. And I guess what we can do is maybe I'll give you some and you can share your thoughts maybe and I'll share my thoughts and we'll just kind of run down the list. I think that's a pretty good all right way to go about it.
Sure.
Yeah. So I started off by looking at some of the arguments for the change, like in favor of this change, right? And I think it mainly stems from MLS moves on Twitter, who I think does a pretty good job of being relatively neutral in his coverage of the league. Um, this is his far. It's kind of weird talking about this like a political stance, right? But this is like his farthest European leaning like idea. um, you know, to he can. And like I said, he makes some pretty good videos, and he's a YouTube guy as well. So go check him out and listen to his video on this because this is kind of where I got most of these points. It was a little bit harder or easier to find things against it, but the first one that he brought up was aligning with the global transfer market. So, I took this and ran with it a little bit, and basically we've seen time and time again, and even our good friend Tommy Scoops mentioned to us while we were talking with him back in the end of the last season that the transfer window is tricky to get from MLS overseas. European teams is the main demographic that MLS keeps saying we're going to try and send our players there, send our players there, send our players there. But that means one of two things has to happen. One, the teams have to give up a lot of times their star players in the middle of maybe a title push, a playoff push, what have you, and make the decision of, can we survive without this player, right? And risk maybe winning that trophy. Or on the flip side, European clubs will have to wait until after the MLS season is over. The player would move halfway through the European season and then has to try and acclimate, contribute right away. And that might stunt their growth or other opportunities. We've seen that already with, Thiago Almada, for example, leaving, right? That timing window, along with money, hasn't really lined up. And then other players, Jordan Mihailovic, Sam Vines, like players who try and go over in the middle of the season and kind of just disappear. So I'm okay with this being a point of emphasis personally, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
I think it's a reasonable point. I don't know if it's enough of a reasonable point that you just completely like dig up the entire schedule and rearrange everything just so that we can align for transfers out, because guys are still moving in and out of the league, like regardless of the differing calendars. We've seen, I feel like, an increase in spending every, like for the at least like the last few off seasons. It just has continuously increased. Teams are bringing in more high reputation players for bigger fees. I think if the deal for Portland for the Monterrey striker goes through, that's like the third maybe double, or sorry, I guess that's what, 7, 8 digit move for a striker this
Come
offseason.
on,
Like,
accountant, count the numbers.
I'm sorry, I'm trying my best. That's like the third 8 digit move for a striker this offseason, which is like, I mean, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I would bet that that's probably the first time that's ever happened in MLS history in one window. So I would say that the differing calendars could probably be a bit more helpful. Sorry, being on the same calendar could probably be a bit more helpful. I don't think the differing calendars is hurting us enough that you would have to just completely change the entire schedule over it.
Yeah, and I'll dive into that a little bit later. I agree with you there, but I think it's a solid point, right? Making those moves would be a lot easier with this in line, and because of that, it's definitely something to talk about. But I don't know if it sways, or to use the term, move the needle. I don't know if it moves the needle enough to do it. But here are some other things that have been brought up. Lining up the international windows. So MLS notorious for playing through international windows with lessened squads, with minimal crowds, right? And each and every year, the question is, which tournaments are they going to play through and which ones aren't they? Are they going to stop for them? Are they going to play through them? If you line up with the other calendar, then you can make your how do I say this? Like your international breaks line up too. So you're on the same page as everybody else.
I think it's another like fair point. Again, I don't know if it's something where you'd probably like rearrange the whole schedule again, but I think it would definitely be beneficial for teams and fans who want to go to games and not have to risk going to games potentially and having all of the key players that you want to go see be on international duty, but teams still playing games. I mean, you're considering MLS is basically not playing in US Open Cup. You've got some more opening in your schedule now. Maybe you can rearrange things, squeeze in a couple more midweek games, and now all of a sudden you can free up that time during the international windows, possibly. I don't know if that's logistically possible. I'm sure there's way more that goes into the logistics of that. So I don't really want to like throw that out as a serious suggestion. However, I mean I can understand that because watching teams play without like 4 or 5 of their key players is basically like watching them play US Open Cup, like a first round game where they're rotated the entire team, and we see what the attendance numbers look like for those games.
Yeah. So here's the thing, right? Every league will play through certain windows or take breaks during certain windows, and the problem is it doesn't really matter which we choose. There's always going to be a crowd calling us a not serious league for whatever decision we make, right? If we play through a window, oh, you're not serious because you're putting out a worse product on the field, your stars aren't around, and everybody else is taking off. So why aren't you? But if we pause, then people complain it's been too long since they've seen a game and they forget about it. And oh, goodness me, how am I supposed to take a league seriously if it's not playing week in, week out? Right. So you're never going to make everybody happy in that sense. Lining up for international windows. I think he mentioned like, oh, like you can do team watch parties and season ticket holder event, like all this sort of stuff. And, they all made sort of sense, but I think it's more of a reach for, oh, like when the culture builds, that's something you can do. And that's fair, but I don't think a lot of people are going to, turn unless they've got like one of their big, Jesus Ferreira in Dallas, as I watch this game right now, right? If he's starting for the men's national team in Copa America, right? And MLS takes a break because that's their schedule and they're able to do that, whatever. Maybe you'll see a bunch of people from Dallas going over and supporting him. But random MLS games with mostly European or random, excuse me, US men's national team, mostly European based players, I don't think would draw a whole bunch of like season ticket based things. And that kind of was the other thing I thought about too, is like it makes sense when we need to stop because a lot of our players are called in. But if we're not losing a ton of our players and we're losing more at a higher rate, right? But if we're not losing a ton of those players, then it's kind of a moot point, right?
Yeah, like something like Gold Cup would probably be a good example of a tournament that they should probably put the brakes on the season for however long the
Absolutely.
Gold Cup's going on, because there's just a plethora of MLS guys that get called in for the Gold Cup, and at that point you're really like you're missing a huge chunk. Like I know there's like Nations League and stuff that goes on, and even from like a US perspective, that may not be super detrimental for the MLS sides. I'm sure there's not a ton of MLS players getting called in, but there's European players that are going to get called in. Guys like Yakimakis for Greece and whatever other competitions are going on. Like there's guys that you're going to lose, but yeah, I mean it's a hard, like I think it's a good point. I think it's a valid point, but I also don't think it's a point strong enough that you would rearrange all the logistics on everything just to make sure that we have off for certain international competitions, because I think you could possibly tweak the schedule you have now with the timing and make it work so that you're off for certain crucial international breaks.
See, what's interesting about this point to me is that this is one of those points that you can have a complete contingency plan for. If you were to change the calendar, this is all the things that you can do. But it's all hypothetical and kind of like I'm going to use it. It's not the right word for it, but I'm going to use the term dreamy, right? It's like this is what my ideal scenario would be, and then you try and play it out, and it doesn't do as well, right? And the last one that was brought up, and it's kind of a 50-50 point, is the weather, right? Specifically in the South, right? Summer weather in places like Texas and um, Atlanta, all those places, kind of makes it difficult to play certain styles, can lead to injury, increased fatigue, all these different negatives of playing in really, really hot conditions, right? Obviously, there's the flip side of it, but in terms of that, what do you think?
I mean, I think what they have now is the smart way to go about it, because you can play in hot weather and take more breaks like they have done in the past, where you have scheduled water breaks to kind of break up the game a little bit more. But if you're playing in like sub-zero weather, you taking a break is only going to make things worse. So there's nothing you can really do to kind of help the situation more if it's super cold or if it's super snowy. Like you could stop and plow the field, but like that's going to take ages and really kill the momentum of the game. And you're not going to be able to like take breaks and warm up. Like you're going to take breaks, stand around, and get even colder. So I was actually looking a little bit ahead of this episode, and maybe I didn't look at it correctly or not, but I wanted to see when the Norwegian and the Swedish league was playing, because like I think in terms of winters, some areas in Canada and even northern US probably experience somewhat similar to how Norway and Sweden might fare. And it looks like they're on a pretty similar time schedule as we are. It looks like they start end of March. I don't know when they end, but if that's the case, then I mean, I feel like that makes sense. They're avoiding the harsh winter months as well, because it would just be nearly impossible to play. You'd be canceling games all the time for snowstorms. And if it like we remember the US game, the freezing one in Minnesota where it would like there were threats of frostbite for like half the players that were out there. Like that was ridiculous. But like imagine you have the threat of that every week because we're playing in the middle of, like deep December, deep January. I think mitigating the hot weather is much more doable than mitigating the cold. So I think the way we're structured right now for the weather is better.
Yeah, so there in this proposal that was brought up, the suggestion is to take off the winter months, just stop playing and then put the Leagues Cup in only the southern states. And that's an interesting idea. Now, in the current climate where Leagues Cup is in the crosshairs of a lot of US soccer, diehards, that's probably not the best idea considering the low attendance and especially when you're play all your teams are playing away games, right? And the teams like Minnesota, for example, who won't get to see their teams play League Cup, like that's not what the point of Leagues Cup is, right? And
Yeah, I
Leagues
think
Cup
that's a
has
sorry,
good.
go ahead.
I was gonna say Leagues Cup has its all a ton of other issues, and we'll cover that at some other point. But we're not saying Leagues Cup is perfect, but to take it and make it a southern state only tournament doesn't, in my opinion, make sense.
Yeah, I know Leagues Cup is not in the good graces of a lot of fans right now, but I think that's completely unfair to fans of teams up in northern teams. Like if you're a Vancouver fan, Minnesota fan, you're basically telling them like, sorry, you'll just never get to see your team play in Leagues Cup. Like you got to watch on TV or you have to fly across the country to go watch them play, which I think that's super unfair to the fans, but then also for the team as well. Like let's say Minnesota plays the tournament, they make a deep run. You're now asking Minnesota to play on the road and travel for like a month straight, which is just completely unfair to them. They don't get to go home at any period for that time. They don't get to like see their family if their family's away from them. Like you're asking them to be gone for a really long period of time just so we can change the schedule around and put this European style schedule in. I don't know, just feels it doesn't feel like a good solution in my opinion for that problem.
Feels like it extends travel, right, for a lot of those northern teams without taking any actual time off. You might actually extend the season a little bit longer, right, with international breaks and things like that. And we already had a big talk about over usage of players and things like that. So, the the weather is one of those. If you're for it, that's your bread and butter. We're not playing in the summer heat, right? That's awesome. If you're against it, which is where we're going to transition to now, it is the worst thing ever because you're playing in the snow, right? Um, and that's one of the main arguments against this move is the fact that if you move to a European calendar, you get a higher chance of games being played like the one we saw last week, LAFC in this massive snowstorm in RSL. Not only is that dangerous to play in, it's not fun to watch, right? Particularly, like it's a fun niche thing, but if you have to do it week in and week out, it's not really a ton of fun. It's also dangerous for if fans try and get out there, right? Fans can sit in heat and have water and hats on and maybe wet scarves, whatever, right? With the cold, even if you're bundled up, I saw something today, and again, take it for what it's worth. It was online on a social media post, but the fans who showed up to the Dolphins versus Chiefs 2-degree game where back in Kansas, wherever they were playing that game, there were multiple fans who were out there who had to get things amputated because they got frostbite to the point where it needed to be removed. So the danger of playing in snow, I think, and again, I'm not saying that it's better or worse. I don't have stats for summer heat stroke and things like that. So I'm not saying one is better or worse. I just happen to have stats for the other one. But then the flip side of this is the suggestion to take these winter months off and maybe play Leagues Cup in it, whatever, right? This year, MLS did a best of 3 playoffs in the first round, took an international break for exactly 1 week, and everybody was complaining that they forgot MLS was happening. So now your suggestion, or the suggestion, I'm not going to say your because it's not one person, right? But the suggestion is let's take 6 weeks off, play Leagues Cup where certain teams will be out indefinitely.
After 2 games.
Right. Which is the same thing that happens in Leagues Cup now, by the way. So I'm not saying like that's the biggest issue, but you're saying that 6 weeks off and then you're going to start up again like nothing ever happened. To me, that sounds like a surefire way to kill off fan engagement and have people take the stance of like, I didn't, I didn't know this was happening. What's going on? Right. And that to me is one of the, you know, red flags in that scenario. And we already talked about the northern teams playing on the road. Oh no, actually we haven't yet. The other suggestion was move it, and then when we're playing early, I think it was supposed to start. When does a prem start?
Like late August, isn't it?
Yeah, it was like when you're playing in those games or whatever it may be. Whenever it was supposed to start, have the super cold teams just play on the road a couple of weeks. Like, and that flips back to the same thing about Leagues Cup being only in the South, right? Like those first couple weeks are like key fan retention weeks, right? My team's back. It's been 2 months off. I see other teams playing in Champions League. If you're the teams that aren't in Champions League, right? I've seen preseason stuff. I've been watching all this other stuff, and now my team's back. I can't wait to do it. Oh, by the way, you need to wait 4 weeks before your team shows up. Tough, right? But your
Yeah.
thoughts on
And I mean, what are
the
you gonna do?
negative
It's yeah, I mean, I think there are good arguments to make for the calendar change, even though I'm not in favor of it. I think the weather one's one of the weaker, if not the weakest, arguments that they could make.
absolutely right, and and I think you mentioned like there were some that were good arguments, right? The calendar and the international window, great, right? But the weather is like those move the needle like that, and the weather brings it back down to this, right? It's a super like there's more wrong with the weather argument than there is right about the transfer argument. And then again, it really falls on where you lie. I do lean more against just keeping it the way it is, and it's mainly going to be for this last point we talk about. But this thing about weather is, first of all, it's always changing, right? The weather is consistently a moving factor. But if you are increasing the chances of all of these snow games for a decrease in the summer weather, which again, I saw a stat. I didn't have time to look up exactly how accurate it was, but May, June, and July, highest attended games in MLS. Why do we think that is?
Probably peak weather.
Well, no. I mean, maybe, yeah. There's no school,
That too.
right? None of it. There's no school. There's maybe summer soccer if you're playing in it, but for the most part, you're off from your club teams, your high school teams, your ODP team, whatever teams you're playing in, right? They're off for those summer months, so you don't have to play all the time, or you're playing 2 times a week. You don't have to worry about doing it at school, whatever. So what do? Okay, I'm going to go to a game, right? If you cut that out and then put the calendar only when we're playing, when we're in school, when we're traveling for college, like whatever it may be, again, you're taking that dive into the attendance numbers, and that's kind of the big kicker for me is I don't think like I think those months are key for us.
Here's the last thing that I will say on it, and then I am refusing to say anything else on it because we've spent a lot of time on this topic. But the last thing I will say, and I know this is a whole other topic that we didn't even touch on this on the schedule change, but considering there are a bunch of teams in this league that share stadiums with other teams, mainly NFL teams, you're now asking for a lot of logistical like hula hoops that these, field what's the right term for them? Like the field management teams or whatever have to now
Grounds
go
crew.
through. Grounds crew. Yeah, yeah. The You're now asking like a bunch of hoops that the grounds crew has to jump through in order to potentially get things aligned correctly and in time, or you're asking now the scheduling groups to kind of like change around everything so that there's not conflict, like there's not an MLS game Saturday at Mercedes-Benz for Atlanta and then the next day the Falcons are playing. Like that's a super tight turnaround, which they don't have to worry about like 8 months out of the year because the NFL isn't going on during the MLS season.
So you actually dove into my last point here, the one I kept alluding to, the competition and logistics around other American sports, right? Other countries, specifically European countries, don't have to worry about competitions with other sports in their country, right? You know, the essence of MLS's survival rate is how it stacks up against NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL. We would not care less personally how we are doing TV ratings against EPL, Bundesliga. Don't care. Because at the end of the day, we don't need to fight with them. We need to fight with the people who are in our own backyard, right? And there are arguments made against this, like MLS playoffs are already coinciding with the NFL season. MLS already plays during NHL and NBA, seasons. Like it's happening all at the same time, right? So, why does this change matter? And the change matters because a good half of this season is played only with the like right now with MLB is mainly the people we're fighting against, and then NBA mid season and MLB early season, right? So a switch to the European calendar means that the entire opening part of the MLS season, minus this 6-week winter break that they've been talking about, is played coinciding with the NFL and most importantly, the college football season. And that is where you die. Because everybody's like, oh, well, why does NFL matter? Because it's on a Sunday and every MLS game plays on a Saturday. You're right. But the other problem is that college football exists. And college football, and I've seen people talk about it already, like, oh, yeah, I miss so many MLS games because my college team is playing on NBC. Whatever, right? That's where you're going to feel this biggest switch. At the start of the season, when you have mostly new fans, new, old, or indifferent, really, it doesn't matter, that are coming into the stadium. If you play the entire first half of the season with college football and NFL, the entire weekend's gone, right? Currently, right now, our playoffs are going against the early part of the NFL season, right? Kind of like September, October, maybe into November. Maybe not as early as I had presumed, right? But you're going into November. Most football is pretty much done. You've got the bowl games and stuff in college, I mean, and the NFL is still playing. And again, if you're a Jets fan, your season's over already, so there's not too much you're worried about, right? But I think the idea that if your team is challenging for a cup, if your team is challenging for playoff spots, like that intensity trumps over some football game against, I think that's the idea. Whether it does or not, I'm not saying it does or not. I think that's the idea, right? But if you were to shift the schedule, MLS regular season versus college and NFL regular season, you lose every time, right? So to have that extra incentive of like, oh, the playoffs happen during the NFL season, you're right. But the playoffs mean more than a random start of the season MLS game, right? And you just can't give those things up. So that's the killer, I think, is NFL and college. Right now, we are circumventing them as best we can, right? There are times we're not, but the important parts of our season end up against those, and we're starting to pull a little bit more from there, or at least hoping to. I don't know what the actual numbers are, but
Well, yeah, I mean, you even have college football during the day then in that case, and then you have the NBA at night. Plays a lot on Saturdays. And now your
mm-hmm.
whole Saturday's killed. So then what
Yeah.
are you going to do? Make MLS teams play on a Friday? Like, I think that's probably even worse. I don't think people are going to watch on a Friday. I think they're done with work and they're, I don't know, doing whatever else they do. Some of the southern states are probably watching high school football. I know that's big on Fridays, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean that's a great point. Honestly, I completely overlooked the college football part of it.
Well,
I
I
think
think
that's
that's why people. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I think that's why
no,
people think that this is such an easy change because everybody does overlook college football because it's not a pro sport,
but it's
but
huge.
It
It's
pulls better
huge.
numbers than every other pro European sport in on the face of the earth. I mean,
Yeah.
the Old Trafford is like the eighth largest college football stadium. Like that's absurd. That's
I know.
stupid. Like that's unreal. And people don't think about that. And again, I'm as I mentioned, I'm completely neutral. I do lean a little bit more towards it, but I can hear both sides. I can make arguments for both sides, and I don't really care. Like I mentioned, I know where I'll be whether we kick off or not. Like at the on the day. But I think at the end of the day, the decision gets made with more weight in the hands of what is going to bring a family of four to the soccer stadium or put them in front of their TV, not what's going to make the soccer purists happy, right? There's some merit to this transfer window idea. I think that's probably the biggest draw of them all. There's some merit to this linking the international windows. I think that's cool too. But at the end of the day, I think the league would do more harm than good by changing the schedule to the viability of certain markets in the league, right? There are certain markets that would survive this change, no problem, but there are others that might not, right? Newer, older markets, Chicago, for example, that are already struggling to pull people, right? If you now stick them in dumb winter weather for a quarter of the season, that's I mean that's basically a death blow, right? And if you start losing teams, the league itself starts to shake. So
All right, Waffler, you've waffled on way too long on this topic. Let's fly
no,
through the last two
we
already.
just started.
I swear we've been going probably close to an hour already.
No
And we
way,
covered one topic.
not a shot.